Welcome, everyone, to the Truth Matters Podcast. I'm Daryl Harrison, your host. Just as a reminder, the Truth Matters Podcast is a production of Grace to You, the media ministry of Pastor John MacArthur. My guest today is Chuck Holmes. Chuck is the founder and director of Mount Nebo Prison Ministry. Mount Nebo is a national organization ministering to prisoners all over the country, and they're also the largest distributor of the John MacArthur Study Bible in English. Chuck, thanks for being here, my friend. I call Chuck my friend because he is a friend of mine. And Chuck, we want to go ahead and get started today by talking about what you do at Mount Nebo Prison Ministry, and talk also about what the Lord is doing with regard to our relationship between Grace to You and Mount Nebo Prison Ministry. So can you go ahead and just get us started off first off by talking about what you do at Mount Nebo and how Mount Nebo and Grace to You have partnered together?
I'd be glad to do that. So Mount Nebo is a teaching ministry, both by desire and design. We want to be a teaching ministry with biblically based materials to incarcerated people, men and women, in our state and federal prisons around the country. So we do that primarily through the Fundamentals of the Faith curriculum put out by Grace Community Church. And it's a 13-chapter fill-in-the-blanks workbook that really is a systematic theology. And so for a lot of the prisoners that get this, Daryl, it's their first exposure to a systematic theology. Many of them are new believers. God has drawn them to himself in county jail or when they get to prison. He's used that soil of fear and despair to bring them to a place where they cry out. And so putting something in their hands, like the Fundamentals of the Faith, to establish that foundation is just a great tool. And then when the inmate finishes that, they send it back, we grade it, and return it to them with a MacArthur Study Bible. And of course, John's Bible, we found it to be a great tool. The prisoners don't have a large library, resources they can go to, so that becomes their library in one book with a concordance and the notes, 50-plus years of John's, or 40-plus years when he did it, of his exegetical, expository preaching, just invaluable. So Ken Copeland sends in the Ken Copeland Study Bible, oxymoron, I think, Copeland Study Bible. But so when they read those notes, so whatever they're reading tends to build their foundation.
Right.
So we prayed as we began this ministry that God would use it to establish a foundation in men and women's life with the Word of God. And so that's at the heart of the ministry. It's a ministry of the Word. We also do it through sending in biblically based books and materials. Many of them we get from Grace to You. John's books are just a rich resource for us. We discovered that you and I get a book, Daryl. We read it and it goes on the shelf. And I've been in a few offices today and looked, and there's a lot of books in a lot of the offices. Yeah. And they'll sit there till the guy's gone to glory. Yeah. And we send a book into the prison system, and that book might get read by 15, 20, 25 guys in its lifetime. So they're really a good bang for the buck. And books are, I decided at the beginning of this, I can only go into one or two prisons, but I can send John MacArthur in. I can send Spurgeon in, or Lloyd Jones, or James Boyce, or the dead guys. I can send the dead guys in, and so the Puritans are another great resource. So prisoners only have a few avenues to learn, and so we encourage people that we have contact with, become a reader if you're not. We literally are what we read as Christians, and so books is a staple of the ministry. They'll be circulating after I'm in glory. They'll be circulating on prison yards around the country, so very thankful for that. So I do this out of my home, Daryl. I always wanted to keep it lean and mean. I have an office in my home in Gilbert, Arizona, and garage is shipping and receiving. And so just kept it lean and mean and work out of that environment.
You mentioned the Puritans earlier. I'm a huge, voracious reader of the Puritans, and I just have to ask you, do you have a favorite Puritan?
Well, that's hard because I got a few of them, but What got me reading the Puritans is someone asked John a question once, and they still ask him, what's your favorite book? What's your favorite 2 or 3 books? And at the top of that list would be Stephen Charnock's The Existence and Attributes of God. So I remember in 1992 listening to John on the radio, and someone asked him that question. This was before Amazon or internet, and they asked him, and he said, so I ran down to the local Christian bookstore and said, I need this book right away. And he said, well, we don't carry that because we'd never sell it. Right. But it's 2 volumes, and I can get it for you, be there in 2 weeks. And so I remember getting Charnock, and it took me 6 months to read through those 2 volumes. But a perfect picture of the Puritans, they're not meant to be a fast read.
Right.
They're meant to be chewed slowly, thought about, and I'd find myself reading a page or 2, Daryl, and just go, I don't need to go on from here. I need to stop. I need to walk in this. And I heard that John made the comment once, it's so true. I didn't know somebody could write that much about God. And so I remember looking at one of the chapters was on the goodness of God. And I was amazed at how much you can write on the goodness of God. And yet we know when you're done writing about it, you're finite, he's infinite. Yeah. And even in heaven, we could make a couple hundred chapters on the goodness of God.
They had such a high view of God, didn't the Puritans?
They did.
Yeah.
And there seemed to be a genuine Valley for Vision is on my 3rd copy of Valley for Vision. I go to it regularly. Either in those seasons where I feel dry, I'm having trouble praying, or I just want to go and motivate my prayers, or I just want to go and get the flavor of someone who writes that just has a humble spirit, repentant. They understand their own sin. They see their sin. They're open with it. They also see the glory and the wonder of God, the majesty of Christ. And so reading those kind of Puritan prayers just good for the heart, good for the soul.
Yeah, I like to say, as it relates to Valley of Vision, you need to read them at your own risk, because those are some very convicting prayers in there from those prayers. I mean, they really wrote, they pulled no punches, even in their prayers.
Yeah, and I can remember sometimes reading one, brother, and I'd go, it's okay to feel like that.
Yeah.
Wow, here's this godly man, humble, and he's feeling what I do that I don't even really want to think about, because it seems it shouldn't be there. Yeah. But we're still fallen. Yes. We're saved, fallen, but that part's there. And to hear other godly men express that, and they were open and clear, like in the Psalms before the Lord, just being transparent and real and authentic. And love the Valley of Vision.
Well, Chuck, let's get started, man. Tell us about how the Lord transformed your life. I mean, your testimony is the stuff of movies. I mean, it really is. So I'm just going to turn over to you.
PG-17.
Yeah. Speak from your heart and just tell our viewers, tell our listeners how the Lord transformed your life in such a way that it led to the founding of Mount Nebo Ministries.
I'd be glad to do that. So when I was in kindergarten, no, I won't start there, Daryl. But I will start when I was young. I think I turned 13 and fell in with some of the neighborhood kids. And actually, I was the guy that the parents said, don't run around with that kid. I had a propensity for just doing things that weren't good. And stealing cars, I had a desire to drive when I was 13. No one had let me. So I knew how to do it. I'd just take your car and drive it. So for 2-3 years, I was living in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul then, and just got into stealing cars. And so one time, 2 other knuckleheads and me decided we were going to steal some cars and drive to California. And we got as far as North Dakota and 2 or 3 stolen cars and got arrested. And I still remember going to court back in Minneapolis, and it was on my birthday. And I remember the judge saying, so how long were you going to stay away from home? And I said, I probably would have come back in a year or so. She said, okay, 1 year in Glen Lake and happy birthday. And so I went to reform school for a year, got out. I'm 14, getting ready 15, already got a reputation, didn't really learn anything. It was some consequences that really didn't have much of an impact. And And then this is to show you I was a sharp kid. So I decided to drop out of school in the 9th grade for a career move at the car wash. They had a bumper dryer job open, and I didn't want to pass that up. So I was working at a car wash and experimenting with some alcohol, and so things weren't looking good. And I remember going up and telling my dad just before I turned 17, I'm tired of people telling me what to do, so I'm going to join the Marine Corps. And he looked and said, the light is not on in this kid's eyes. So I joined the Marine Corps in '65, and if you're a student of history or as old as I am, you know, Vietnam was picking up steam at that time. And when I got to boot camp, I was the smallest guy in my platoon of 90 guys. They made me what they call a house mouse. And that was a particular guy that the drill instructors would mess with a lot. I had to eat double what was on the plate of everyone else. When someone else might get a 5-minute break, I had to go out to a weight pile and exercise. So they wanted to beef me up, make me grow. So anyway, I just gravitated toward that discipline and structure right away, Daryl, and kind of fell in love with the Marine Corps. So part of boot camp is learning its history, learning about the Frozen Chosen and Chesty Puller and Korea and the wars, and really begin to get instilled a sense of pride in the Marine Corps very early on. So I graduated boot camp, went to infantry training, and got out with a meritorious promotion. So I went home with a stripe and spent 30 days, and I wanted to go to Vietnam. So I had grown up watching guys like John Wayne, Audie Murphy, and now the Marine Corps had trained me, and I was just ready to get busy and do what they had trained me to do. But that didn't work that way. I got sent to Camp Lejeune and drank that water for 6 months, and went to school as an electrician, got trained, putting in my paperwork to get to Vietnam, and got another meritorious promotion after school. And then they sent me to California and trained me to be a combat MP. And so I actually was walking the streets of Oceanside for a few weeks with a .45 and telling people to tuck in their shirts, and got trained there, picked up another meritorious promotion. So I had a little under 2 years in the Marine Corps. My paperwork was in to make sergeant. At not even 19 years old, I would have been one of the youngest sergeants at that time in the Marine Corps. And I got my papers for Vietnam. Well, I married my childhood sweetheart, Sandy, and 4 days later got on a plane and landed in Da Nang in December of 1967. And without going into a lot of the particulars in Vietnam, I went over. Again, I was gung-ho, loved the Marine Corps, and got over there and got it sent up to the northern part of South Vietnam to an area called Dong Ha. And they had signed me running a large generator and doing electrical work in a large compound. And just started, the thing to do to kill time there was smoke weed. And so began to smoke weed on a regular basis. And then some guys would get some mushrooms or LSD. And so I just right away, I became the Will Rogers of the drug world. I never found one I didn't like. And so I started using drugs. I got sent out into the bush at that time because right away I just began to rebel against the authority and my superiors, and they put me out in the bush. And so I spent 10 months of my 13 in the bush in places like Khe Sanh and Con Thien. Saw a lot of action, saw a lot of what war does, saw a lot of death and destruction, saw the depravity of man carried out. And when I got back onto that plane 13 months later, I was just a different person.
You know, I want to go back, if I can, to your enlistment in the Marine Corps initially. Help me understand. And you don't need to go into specifics or particulars about this. I just want to have a general understanding of how you juxtapose no longer wanting to be under your father's authority, but you say you were drawn to the structure and discipline of the Marines. I mean, how does that marry together?
Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah. And so if you're trying to like find a reasoning in there, So what I'm really trying to get across there is that's kind of on the level of thought and decisions that I operated on, like dropping out of school for a career move at the car wash. So that was just the kind of, it was the most uncritical kind of thinking you could have. So it didn't make sense. So the idea that I'm tired of people telling me what to do in the household, because I was still living at home and didn't want to, and probably a dozen other ways to do, but joining the Marine Corps, I think just subconsciously I was looking for some direction in some place, and so the Marine Corps answered that.
Okay. So you marry Sandy.
Yeah.
Okay, can you pick up there?
Yeah, so Sandy and I met her after I got out of reform school, and she was after an outlaw, and I was glad to be one. And so we got married in San Jose and said farewell. And I think back to that, looking at even then how my thinking, my emotions. I married Sandy because it seemed like the thing to do. If you were to ask me, you must have loved her even at 17. What do you know? Well, there'd be some degree of caring. I married her because I thought I had to, and I thought it was the thing to do. And I didn't really take it as a very serious step. I didn't see it as a covenant before the Lord. That's for sure. Yeah.
Okay. So you didn't see it as a covenant. So you and Sandy, you're married now. Okay. So what's the next event that happens in your life?
Well, so you get an R&R from Vietnam for 6 days. So I met Sandy in Hawaii those 6 days, come right out of the jungle, right out of war, right out of combat. And all of a sudden you're in Hawaii in a hotel and you're going down to dinner. And I'm still in the jungle in my mind. I'd been getting high for 5 months over there. So I wanted to go hang out in the bars a lot. And, I remember renting a motorcycle. I was there and picked up 5 tickets for 2 with no helmet and riding on the beach and speeding. And then 6 days later, kissed Sandy goodbye and back to Vietnam. And so, so when I got on that plane to come home, I was thankful to come home. But I look back on that, Daryl, a lot of guys over there were afraid of something happening. They were very careful. It was a place you could get hurt very easily or worse, depending where you were. I never had any thoughts of that. And I'd like to say, I was just so brave. I was just stupid and really had no thoughts, concerns about I could die over here. And I was doing risky stuff. I was out in the villages, getting high out there with where I shouldn't have been, where something could have happened. And again, looking back, as you and I understand the doctrine of election, that none of the elect perish before God draws them to themselves. And so even back then, we talk about ministering spirits. And I wouldn't say this is theologically biblical, but if I had a couple of angels watching over me, they were busy. And so God kept me from harm, I'm sure. And although I'm sure I tested him a number of times through my life. So when I got back from Vietnam, Sandy and I hooked up, and I had a 30-day leave, and we moved to Oceanside. And I got to Oceanside, and the Marine Corps, I reported into the company, and they wanted to send me to cold weather survival training in the mountains of Nevada after I'd just come from the tropics. And I thought, well, that makes sense. And so I decided I wasn't going to do that. And I faked an injury, and I was still getting high. I was doing heroin at that time. And we were living off base in Oceanside. And the weekends, Daryl, I was running down to Tijuana and getting high and just getting drunk and coming back for Monday morning to report in. And so Sandy got pregnant at that time. And after about 4 or 5 months of those weekends like that and just neglecting her, no real concern, doing what I wanted to do, which became the pattern of my life, she left. And it was a short time later that I just was AWOL from the Marine Corps and got picked up and tossed in the Camp Pendleton Brig. And the brig was a tough place. And as far as I know, I'm the only man that ever escaped from the Camp Pendleton brig up till that time.
And a brig is a military prison.
It's a military prison, and I was, it's a double fence gun towers, but I was on a work detail with a couple of guards just outside the prison fence. And though I hadn't planned it, the two guards were just, they weren't doing what they were supposed to do, and they were talking. It was lunchtime, and I got away. Mm-hmm. And ran to a barracks of some people I knew, and within half an hour I heard sirens going off. And so anyway, I did get away and was gone a couple months and got a hold of some draft dodgers and deserters that were, if you remember that time during Vietnam War, there was a lot of protests. And so they were welcoming Vietnam veterans that were protesters or wanted to speak out against the war. And so I got a hold of one of those organizations, and they were going to take me to Canada. And so the night before I was going to go to Canada, I was in Fresno, California, all loaded under barbiturates and driving a friend's car, and bounced off some curbs, and I got arrested and got taken back to the Camp Pendleton brig.
So it sounds like a sort of AWOL underground railroad. You know, this sort of network, if you will, of draft dodgers and AWOL individuals that would get you all the way into Canada.
Well, they would. In fact, Daryl, when I had escaped from the brig and was gone that evening, I actually went down to Tijuana, where I used to go and party all the time, and went down there and partied for 2-3 days, waiting for a friend to get off work, a Marine Corps friend to get off work, and drive me up to San Jose to where my family was. Mm-hmm. And I was at Dana Point, and I've taken my wife back there to look at this place. I was at Dana Point, hiding in some bushes, and the meeting place, and all loaded, and there was a cop came with a spotlight and began to look around there, and I thought the cliff went like this, but it went like this, and kind of did one of those road runner things. And I literally went down a couple 200 feet on a cliff, scraped all the skin off my back, tore all my clothes off. I hit a ledge, broke my ankle, the bone shot up through my boot, and rolled the rest of the way down. And I guess the cop didn't see me go off there. Anyway, I was really hurt, bleeding, bloody, and managed to get back up on a road and called my friend. He did pick me up, and I was in bad condition, really almost in shock. And we already had the name of the draft dodger reserter outfit. We called them, and they actually took me to Pasadena and took me to a hospital and flipped the bill to get my foot set and cleaned up, and then took me to a safe house for 3 days in Pasadena till my brother from San Jose could come pick me up. Mm-hmm. So they were an underground network, and they wanted to take draft dodgers, deserters, get them up to Canada, then do some videos and use those as part of their propaganda on the war effort.
Okay.
So that never happened again. Mm-hmm. So when I got back to the brig, I had become very angry, volatile, and they got me back to the brig after the escape. And there was a scene that kind of set the course for some things later in my life. The captain of the brig came in, and I wasn't standing at attention. I was with a couple of MPs had me, and he told me to get at attention. And I told him, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm all done with that. And he said, you will get at attention. And I told him, I don't think I will. And so he talked to these MPs, and they took me in a back room and literally beat me, assaulted me, took my clothes off, stripped me down naked, hung me upside down over a rafter, urinated on me, punched me, beat me. Remember, I was yelling and cursing, and they took a sponge and rubbed it around the toilet and shoved it in my mouth. And every time I'd pass out, they'd let me down till I'd regain consciousness. Some more beating. I think they hoisted me up 2 or 3 times. And after 5-6 hours of that, I said, okay, I'm ready. And they brought me in, and they woke up this captain, and as he came in and sat down, I still remember him lighting his pipe. And at that time, the remorse quickly left, and just the anger came up again. I remember spitting on him. And so he just said, take him to the hole. So I was in, they took me to solitary confinement, and they put me in a strip cell. And that's just what it sounds like. It's a 6x8 cell where you have a mattress, and you roll it up at 5 in the morning, and they set it outside your cell, and you get it back at 5 in the afternoon. Other than that, you really have nothing. Mm-hmm. And so they feed you under the door. They fed you twice a day under the door, and they had to let you out twice every 24 hours to use the restroom. And you'd go down there and use the restroom. And if you had to go outside of that, you'd have to use the milk cartons that you would get with your meals. Mm-hmm. So generally, they'd bring someone who had trouble in the general population in there, and they'd be in there a week, 2 weeks, to adjust their attitude. After you spent a couple of weeks in there, you were ready just to go out and comply. 30 days was the max by their own laws that they could leave you in there, because it really was inhumane. Mm-hmm. And so all that anger, all that hatred was there. I was determined that I would not comply ever with anything they ever said. And so I found some constructive things to do with those milk cartons full of things. Would count time come by, and I picked up an assault in the brig over that, and had a pending court-martial coming for escape. So my 30 days went by, and 90 days went by, and 6 months went by, and I was there 8 months in that strip cell. And often during that time, out of continuing to try to break me, they'd come at night and hose me down with water and put fans on me all night. Or they'd cut me to dim rations, which was half a boiled potato and some cabbage, and leave you on that for 4 or 5 days. And so we were in a contest. And that's how much hatred and anger I had in me, that all I had to say was, I'll comply. And I'd be back out in general population.
That was a battle of wills, so to speak, right? It was a battle
of wills, yeah. And so I'd never been suicidal, but I had decided that I know how to beat these guys. It wasn't even that I just was in despair. It was, I'm going to beat them out of these 2 court-martials. And the time they're going to make me do, I'm just going to kill myself. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking of some ways that I could do that in there. It happened in there. Guys hung themselves. So I had wrote out a letter to my mom and dad and just kind of said goodbye and told them some of the things that had happened. My regular letters, they weren't letting out. Mm-hmm. My folks, I'd get a letter from them. And if I wrote just a general letter, I'm okay. I didn't want to worry my mom. I'd write a letter, I'm okay, I'm doing all right. And so I wrote a letter and just really revealed what was happening. Well, providentially, Darrell, there was a guard that was hung in the mess hall at the Camp Hillen Brig. There was race riots, rape, murder, and I had quite a reputation. Life magazine did an article on the Camp Hillen Brig in '69. I was actually on the front cover, I believe, of the Life magazine. So the military doesn't like it when outside people are making inquiries, and my folks got a hold of a congressman in northern Arizona, or Northern California, excuse me, and he made some inquiries to the base commander. And because of that, all of a sudden, my door opened up, and a couple of guards said, come on, you're getting out. And I was in a frame of mind at that time, brother, where I thought they were there to kill me. They'd had enough, and they were going to take me out. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't come out of my cell. I hadn't cut my hair in about 7 months, looking a little crazy. Mm-hmm. And so wouldn't come out. And they kept telling me, no, you're getting out, you're getting out. So they brought a chaplain up, and he talked me out and walked me out of the brig. I went through to a discharge board 2 days later. In fact, one of the mistakes I regret as I look back on that, there was a colonel on the board, and he said, you know what, we'd like to give you a medical discharge under general conditions, mm-hmm. but you'll have to stay here for 3 weeks and go through that process, and you could stay right here in this encampment, and when you're done, you'll have a medical discharge and you'll have your benefits, mm-hmm. or I can give you an undesirable mm-hmm. discharge today. And I told him, give me the undesirable with a bunch of vulgarity.
You were ready to go.
I was ready to go. And I'd like a redo on that one. Give me a mulligan, because all the benefits and that stuff. But that's where I was at.
You
at
lost
that time.
all of that by virtue of the undesirable discharge.
Correct. Yeah. And so they brought me to the base of Camp Pendleton, gave me the boot, I gave them the finger, and departed after 4+ years in the Marine Corps. And I went back to Minneapolis, St. Paul, where Sandy was with my daughter Kelly, and moved in with them and was working, and things were going pretty good for a couple of months. And then I decided, you know what, I ran into some guys at work that had some weed, and I thought I can, I'm working hard, things are going good, I can smoke a little weed on the weekend, have a couple of brews, and it's not going to hurt anybody. Well, that picked up steam pretty quick for me, and then some guys at work had some harder stuff, and it wasn't long, and Sandy said, you need to leave. And by then I had got a little transportation and went and looked up some friends of mine that I had joined the Marine Corps with, and found one of them, and they were into doing armed robberies. And they asked me, would you like to get in on it? I said, in fact, we're going tonight, and we really need a driver. And I said, I can drive well. So I went on that first armed robbery. I think it was a Piggly Wiggly in Minneapolis, and got almost $30,000 in that one robbery. And it was a 3-way cut. And so I went from drug addict with no money to a drug addict within a week, an apartment and dresser drawer full of cash. And so we were, every 2 weeks, we were going out and robbing a supermarket in St. Paul or Minnesota. And it was coming out in the papers, and I was always the unidentified suspect. I'd wear a trench coat, a mask, gloves, carried a sawed-off 12-gauge and a .45. And I was a serious guy. And I look back, Daryl, just thankful today that I didn't kill anybody, because I was ready to do that. In a heartbeat, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. And we went from 3 of us to 5 of us. And I had dresser drawers full of cash, and living in the fast lane, and living in the dark, not out in the light too much. And they were looking hard for us. And my friends decided they wanted to start robbing banks. And because the supermarkets now were pretty much closed down, they were getting rid of their cash. And so the first bank robbery they went on, I was too sick to go. I had hepatitis. I was bright yellow. I weighed 130 pounds and didn't go. Well, they saw their license plate. One of them got clearly identified and came out in the papers, and the manhunt was on. And so if you're a criminal, you learn that if your crime partners get busted or they're under heat, that's a good time for you to leave. So I left everything I had accumulated there, walked away from it, just took the cash, and I had somewhere between $25,000, $30,000 in cash. And I flew out to California and moved into a cabin up in the Santa Cruz Mountains with a friend of mine that I had met in Vietnam. And we just commenced to party. And so if you're an alcoholic or a drug addict, money runs out. And so after 2-3 months, that money ran out. And I got up one Friday morning and took a 12-gauge and sawed it off and loaded up and borrowed my friend's car. And late that afternoon, I drove over to San Jose, and I started, as soon as it got late, I started in one motel, robbed it, and along the Bayshore Freeway from San Jose to San Francisco, I robbed 6 or 7 motels. Went back, and then the next weekend, I went loaded on barbiturates and drinking, and 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning. The same kind of decision as a career move at the car wash. I decided I'd go rob something in Santa Cruz and drove down there drunk, loaded. The only thing that was open at 2 on a Sunday morning was a donut shop. So I went in, stuck them up for $8 and 6 Long John donuts, maple filled. And I remember as I'm robbing this guy, I find out later that he's a wrestling coach at Santa Cruz High. And I could tell he was a little froggy and looking for an opportunity. And he said, well, I've got my wallet in my glove compartment. because I asked him, "Where's your wallet? I want some cash." And he said, "I've got it in my glove compartment." So I walked him out there, took him the driver's side because it was open, and he reached in and he started to come out with a flare gun. And so I hit him pretty hard with a shotgun. Didn't kill him, thankfully. And then he gave up his wallet that had no money in it. And within 2 blocks of driving away from the donut shop, the lights came on, and they arrested me. And I found myself in a Santa Cruz jail for the next week going through lineups. And they identified me for 8 armed robberies, and they put a couple I didn't do. And so then they made a plea deal with me that they'd drop all the armed robberies but one if I just plead guilty to the $8 and the donuts. And they actually had the donuts in court and at the arraignment, and there was a bite out of one of them, and the district attorney said, "So when did you take the bite out of this donut? I'm curious." And I said, "When I got to my car, I was hungry." And there was some laughter in the courtroom. But what wasn't funny, Daryl, was my dad was behind me and my sister. My mom couldn't get herself to come. And the judge, when they sentenced me, said 5 to life in the California penitentiary. And I can still hear the wind being sucked out of my dad. And I'd heard a lot of stories about prison. I'd been in the jail there for 3 or 4 months with some convicts, and I knew I was on my way to a very dangerous place. And I was afraid. And I hadn't really experienced fear much.
I was going to ask you, is that the first time you've ever even been afraid of anything?
I believe it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. A real sense of fear. And then I thought, well, once they find out I'm a former Marine and a Vietnam veteran and a notorious donut bandit, that I'll get there and settle in on the yard. But I looked like I was 18 or 19 years old. I looked young for my age. The abuse of the drugs and alcohol, I weighed about 135, 140 pounds. I was small. So I got to the reception center in Vacaville, California, and spent almost 90 days there as they process you, figure out if you're a gang member, and try to determine where they're going to send you in the system. There was a number of places I had heard of that I hoped they weren't going to send me. And they sent me to California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo. So that was in 1971. The prisons then were like they are now, but they were particularly violent. In fact, just one story I remember, Daryl, when I was in a reception center at Vacaville, so I'd been in about a month. If you had a life top, you had to stay in a certain section, and if they took you to the store, they took you shackled and cuffed. And it was just part of what they did with lifers. And so I shuffled to the commissary, and I'm getting ready, and out of the side of my eye, I see him walking a prisoner down the hallway with a guard on the 4 corners, and he's in the middle, shackled. And I'm watching this, and I see a guy break out from the side of the hallway, run in, and just start stabbing this guy. And the cops, they didn't jump in, they just backed up, started blowing their whistles, and he probably stabbed that guy 20, 25 times. And I'm just looking at it and knew that I had stepped into a different world.
This was totally, or did you, let me phrase it as a question, did you in that moment have flashbacks to being in the bush in Vietnam? Was what you just saw in that moment in prison, did that give you sort of a visage, oh my gosh, where I am now is worse than where I was back in 1968?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really was years later, after I came to Christ, really, that as I look back and tried to think through those things. I don't know if I was too dumb to be afraid in Vietnam. Also, I had a weapon.
Yeah.
I was trained.
Right.
I felt I could deal with situations.
Yeah.
But I didn't have a weapon in there.
Right.
And I was small, and I was, you might say, easy prey. Even though I didn't feel that way in my heart, I knew what I would allow and not allow. All that anger was still there, and I would hurt you if I could.
So the anger was somewhat of a weapon for you.
It was.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. And it was just there, and it was prevalent, and it just laid on the surface all the time. And yet I knew I knew enough in the survival mode to know that, I've got to keep that in check. It might serve me, and I'll probably need it, but I couldn't walk with my chest sticking out, and because that's a place in there. It's a food chain mentality, and you have guys in there that can literally smell fear. Yeah. They're in there for life. They make their living off of fear and intimidation. Over my course of that first sentence, I seen a lot of young guys get raped, saw guys get killed. It was a very, very serious world. If you had a dispute with your neighbor out here, you can resolve it civilly, or nothing else, you can move. There you can't do that. Whatever happens, it happens there, and you got to deal with it. And so when I did get to that first prison yard, I had some confrontations initially. I had put on a little bit of weight in that 90 days, and but I had a couple guys come out, for instance, and they gave me a list with some items written on it, cigarettes, ice cream, and they said, when you go to the store, you're going to get us these items. And I remember, and they made me take the list. I took the list, and they said, we'll be waiting. And I saw that happen over the years. The guy'd go get his groceries, come back with a sack, and hand it to somebody. And that's the way he's going to do his time from then on. And I remember laying in my cell that night and going, I'm never coming out of here, because I am going to kill somebody before I'll let that happen, or I'm going to be killed. And I didn't see any middle ground there. And I remember, Daryl, I had been assigned a job in the electric shop, so I went there, and an older Latino gentleman that had a lifer and kind of knew things that were happening on the yard, and just tried to give me some wisdom, and said, I know you're having problems on the yard, and you need to deal with that. And I said, I know I need to. And so he gave me a shank, prison knife, and I took it to the yard. And that night I went out, and about 6:30, those guys were making their regular rounds on the yard, and I walked up to them and just looked them in the eye and said, I don't know what you see in my eyes, but I'm not going to do my time like that. And so we're just going to have to deal with it, man. I think they knew I was packing, and I was ready to go. That anger was right there. I mean, I was ready to get with it.
You were ready to even die if it came to that, to defend yourself and to send a message.
Absolutely.
To them. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, if they'd have wanted to deal with it, one of us wasn't leaving there.
Right.
Yeah. And so they just moved on. They kept walking. And so I didn't know, is this over or not? But I thought, I'll just let that go. They moved on to easier prey. And so I found out fear is a great motivation. And so I don't think anyone there could see my fear. So I saw guys come in over the years, and you could see the fear. You could smell it. You could just tell by their body language or their, and what they allowed even to be said to them, disrespected. And I found out really quickly, don't make eye contact, keep your head down. You don't want, you're not looking to make friends with anybody, do your own time. And that the Lord in His grace was even protecting me from some things back then, like being raped in prison. I don't know if I could have lived with that. So even then, his hand was in there to some degree. And so I just started going out to the weight pile for 2-3 hours a day, and I just pumping iron and eating everything I could get my hands on. I remember I'd go sit next to the Muslims when we were having pork, and you gonna eat that? And I'll trade you my dessert. And then my mom was sending me in $50 a month. So I'd go to canteen and buy protein and buy peanut butter. And so within 4 or 5 months, I put on 40, 50 pounds, got buffed, went out and changed a few dental records on the yard of guys that had been giving me a hard time, and established myself of someone that's doing their time and you don't want to mess with them. Found a couple of what we would call road dogs in there, guys that I would run with that were just solid guys, and also became affiliated at that time with the white supremacist groups. That's where my heart was. They want to know who's who, and are you going to be there if something happens? And so I just gravitated toward that naturally at that point. And so I started looking for answers. I was going to AA and NA and Living Free and anger management, and got into transcendental meditation and looked at the occult and reading Psychology Today and really trying to better myself. And really, it grew my confidence and self-esteem grew. And I knew that if I came out of there, that I wouldn't come back again. I absolutely knew that. And I began to write my wife, Sandy, while I was in. And she saw some change. And so I stepped out some years later. And she joined me in San Jose with Kelly. And things were going really good for a while. I was working and doing the home life. And it really was. It was good. My folks had furnished a small apartment for us, and just Mom was happy her boy wasn't in prison anymore. And they had come to visit me every 4 or 5 weeks, and your loved ones actually do the time with you.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And especially moms have that just kind of unconditional love. And they blamed everything on Vietnam, especially my mom. I never did. Even looking back, did it impact me? I'm guessing it did. But I was just an angry person. I was concerned about one thing, me doing what I wanted to do. I liked adrenaline rush. I like pleasure. I loved sin. Sin was very attractive to me.
You were the consummate hedonist.
I was a consummate hedonist, not a John Piper hedonist,
right?
But a Chuck Holmes hedonist.
Yeah.
And so I actually met Timothy Leary when I was in prison.
Mr. LSD?
Mr. LSD in a visiting room. He had jumped on and went to London or something, and then came back with some heiress he met over there, and he was at California Men's Colony. So he'd be in a visiting room. I got some pictures with Timothy, and also when LSD was big, I wasn't a guy for taking 1 or 2. I'd take handfuls of LSD, and I couldn't get enough of whatever drug it was. I couldn't get enough. And so anyway, again, I started smoking weed and drinking on the weekends, and Sandy departed. So when I met Sandy, when I'd come back from Vietnam, she had become a Jehovah's Witness. And then I was a heroin addict, and the compatibility was minimal. So try this, read this, try this, read this.
Right.
So she had dropped that, and I had cleaned up, and so we got back together in San Jose. Then I started drinking. Well, my parole officer turned out to be a Jehovah's Witness. He found out she was, and I'd come home from work, and he'd be up there with watchtowers and with my wife studying, and so I said, well, I'll let her do that, and maybe she'll let me do this, but it didn't work out that way. So anyway, she left, and I started going into bars and partying, and all that anger was still there, Daryl. And very easy in the bar atmosphere, especially bars I was going into. I was always on with some jerk besides me. And I just expressed my anger and getting in fights on a regular basis, nearly every night.
I'm sorry, Chuck. You're reading my facial expression, I'm sure. I just got to pause here and say, what were you trying to accomplish by expressing your anger? It's like you were looking for opportunities to just let this anger manifest itself in the most egregious way possible. Yeah. What were you trying to accomplish?
Well, what
did you think you were trying to accomplish?
Yeah, if you'd have asked me back then, I wouldn't have had any clue. What are you talking about? People make me angry, and that's when I look back on it, I think one of the things I saw is when I was growing up in school, I was always the smallest kid. If I weighed 90 pounds, 80 of it was mouth. And so I was constantly in fights and never won one, but always getting in them. And then when I remember that, so we talked about fear going into the penitentiary. That was the first time I had really experienced fear. And I didn't like that.
Why do you think you were afraid?
It's just such a serious world.
Got it.
And also the thought of being raped, to being sexually molested, or the thought of they would think they can do that to me is very disrespectful. that made me angry. And so there was a part when I came out of prison, buffed and angry and mad, there was a part of me was getting even for making me feel afraid for all those years, because now I didn't have to, because I can deal with you.
Got it.
So anyway, there'd be some mornings, Daryl, I'd wake up and have blood on my shirt or broken knuckle, and don't even remember the fight, and have to call somebody and say, man, what happened? Don't you remember? And man, you really hurt that guy. And I actually stabbed a guy there in a barroom fight, but never got busted for it. And yeah, just I guess he dealt with it, whatever it was. But so that culminated in me stabbing a guy in a parking lot one night in a bar, and I got arrested and went back to prison. And now there was no fear. I probably wasn't on the yard 3 days, and I had my hustle going, and ran into a couple guys I knew from the first time I did time. And so in the prison system, I was what you would call I was a stand-up convict. You could trust me. You knew who I was. I knew how to do time. If things came down, race riot or anything, they knew where I'd be. That's another part that was festering and growing. That was just a legitimate hatred in my heart for other races, and we would say other ethnicities now.
Let's get to your conversion story.
Okay.
Let's talk about how your heart was converted by the Lord.
So I'm gonna blow through a little more depravity. Okay. So I went back to prison another time for a stabbing. So I was a 3-time loser, and then I had picked up six, 7 drunk drivings, bunch of stuff. Became a master manipulator. I found out that I could use people and manipulate them. And so everyone that came across my path for years was a victim. I began to use meth, hard drugs, shooting meth every day. Laura, who I'm married to now, just celebrated our 40th anniversary, Daryl, and been together 43 years. Wow. She was another victim. She was a friend of my sister. Why my sister would introduce her best friend to me, I have no idea. But I was on a run then, parole violation, or jumped a bond, had bondsmen chasing me, introduced me to Laura for a date. And so I brought my suitcase over right away and moved in. And again, so I put Laura, I had stepkids, and then Laura and I had a son together, Daniel. And so this will give you a picture where I'm at. Now, I just covered a lot of where I was. I left out a lot of just depravity that we really couldn't put on any kind of film. I had no limits, nothing I wouldn't do. Got to a place where I had no conscience. I was that guy in Romans 1. God had given him over to his sin and just allowed him to do what was ever in his heart. And so to give a picture of where I was, we had Daniel together. So I had 3 kids at the house in San Jose, and I walked out one day to get a pack of cigarettes and called up a hooker I knew, picked her up and drove out to Mesa, Arizona. Just walked away from the family. Didn't give it another thought. Nothing about my little boy. Not a phone call. Not some excuse. Just didn't care. Didn't care. Left Laura and those kids in the house, and I don't want to think about them. Let's go out here and get loaded and have fun. And so I was out there a couple months, and the hooker left, and I called Laura and conned her into leaving her job and coming out to Arizona because things were going to be better, and she loved me. And she did that. Another 3 years of emotional abuse and neglect, doing drugs every day. So in July of 1989, I was arrested for selling a stolen motorhome to an undercover police officer. And it was a beautiful motorhome, gave him a great deal on it. I thought cops aren't that bright, man. And it just didn't have a pink slip. So a few days later, I was arrested. And in fact, when I sold him that motorhome, we were making the deal inside the motorhome. And I remember him standing up to hand me the money. And I knew right away, it seemed like I was being filmed. And so I stood up and I said, "You're a cop." He got all indignant. I'm not a cop. And I grabbed the money and I said, but your money's good. I was so strung out. So, I mean, drugs was the only thing. That $1,500 to me was, I couldn't have found $10 somewhere. Mm-hmm. I mean, I had no bridges. They were all burnt. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I got picked up a few days later. And when they put me in that squad car, Darrell, it was just a long line of squad cars in my life. No fear. You'd think I'd have a thought about, what about Laura? Mm-hmm. What about my son at home, my little 3-4-year-old curly-haired, blonde-haired? So what about him? What about the kids? Not one thought about that. I knew I was going back to prison. The only thing I thought about in that squad car was, in fact, I remember asking the cop, what time is it? And he told me. I thought, I hope I get booked in time for lunch. It's my only thought. I knew if I missed lunch, I'd have to wait till dinner. And they took me down, put me in booking, and in a cell made for 10 guys, and there was like 40, 50 guys in there, and it was hot, and I crawled under a bed and just laying my head on my arm waiting to hear my name to get booked. And all of a sudden, something very foreign began to happen. Just very strange, out of nowhere. I just began to feel this kind of sense of guilt. And I tried to just dismiss it, and it just kept coming back. And I know now what it was the Holy Spirit just bypassing that flawed, evil conscience, was beginning to convict me. And as I laid there for hours, my conscience became alive. And I laid there and I looked at a long, never-ending line of people that I'd hurt. All victims that I'd used to one degree or another, that I'd hurt physically, emotionally. I looked at the years of how I'd lived my life and the people I'd hurt without any feeling of remorse or guilt. The only thing I'd ever feel guilty about was I didn't get enough from you. And as I laid there for 2.5 hours, and all of a sudden, from deep within, and I hadn't wept, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd cried. It just wasn't there. I remember went through a program, and they said, you're a sociopath, and so that would be the poster child. Had no feelings, no capacity to love, no sense of right or wrong even at that point, and just totally dark and depraved. And as I lay there with that overwhelming sense of guilt, I remember my mom. All of a sudden I thought of my mom and dad in their 70s, who only lived a few blocks from me, who I never had time. I couldn't remember the last time I told them I loved them or hugged them. The only time I'd go over to their house, Darrell, was to put the touch on them or something. And I thought of Laura, all those years of her life, because she loved me, how I'd used her and abused her. Never physically, but emotionally, verbally used her. I thought of the kids, the stepkids, who I always made them go to their room. And as I laid there, I guess what God used to break my heart was, I remember just 2 days before being all wired up on meth and out tweaking on my truck, and I looked down and there was my little son Daniel looking up at me. And I remember looking at him and just yelling, screaming at him, what do you want? Get out of here. Go play with your friends. Quit bothering me. And I remember the tears in his eyes. And I would think confusion. And what he wanted was his dad, like he saw other people had. Couldn't do it, man. It wasn't there. And all of a sudden, I just began to weep, laying on that jailhouse floor under that bed. Just started to weep uncontrollably. In fact, you could hear the sobs and had people looking, but all kinds of things happen in booking, so most people don't pay attention to it. But I knew it was happening, and I just started weeping, and I cried out. I remember crying out, God, help me. It was a God I didn't know. Nobody had ever shared the gospel with me. I knew absolutely nothing about Christ. And they called my name, and I got booked and fingerprinted, and they took me upstairs to the tanks, and I can't stop weeping. It just won't stop. And just a continuing overwhelming sense of guilt and burdened with with this sin. And I walked into the tank, and I'm trying to hide my face because I'd been a devout, active racist for 20 years and hated people. And I saw the ink and who's who, and I didn't want them to see me being weak. And I went in and sat down on a bunk in a cell, and there was a guy sitting there. Young guy, his name was Sean, good-looking kid, and he had a Bible open before him. And I just put my head in my hands and was weeping, and he looked over at me and he said something like, "Looks like you're having a tough day." And the only thing I could say, Daryl, was, "I am a miserable person." And you know what? This kid was gone the next day while I was sleeping. They rolled him up. He was gone. And I looked back on that, and Angels minister to people in prison. He was one of them. And one of the reasons that would make me say that was a kid who's 25 shared the gospel, and he didn't just share Jesus loves you, say a prayer. He began to walk me through the scriptures. And what does the scripture say? First, he told me about this God, that there's a God, and he's a holy God, and he's a righteous God, and he's a God of judgment, and he's a God of wrath, and he hates sin. And sin is what alienates us from God. And sin is cosmic treason. And he was using words, biblical words, that even to this day, looking back 30-something years later, this was July of '89, I've never heard such a clear biblical gospel as Sean presented to me. And he walked me through these truths, and he said, if you die in your sin, you will go to a place called hell. And he gave me a biblical description of hell as good as I've ever heard. I mean, I literally was just, fear was there. Such a good description of hell. I was afraid. And I remember just kind of thinking, man, I felt bad before I started talking to this guy. And then he took me to the cross. And he told me what Jesus had done. And he told me that he had went to the cross and sacrificially gave his life to pay for every sin ever committed by every person that would ever believe. And that if I would trust in Jesus, that he would cleanse me, that he would make me white as snow, that he would wash away my sin, that I would be forgiven, that he would shower me with mercy, that I would no longer be headed for hell, but that my destiny would be heaven, that he would change my life. And I just said, give me Jesus, man. Yeah, I want Jesus. No shame, didn't care who heard me. From the moment of regeneration, I was just loud. I was as abrasive vulgarly as I was, now sanctified. And so right away, just both, give me Jesus. And we hugged. He shared some more truths with me. He had a King James Bible there he gave me. And he said, just start reading John. Just start reading John. And I remember getting on the phone and in tears. And I really didn't care who saw me. And I was still that, guys in the tank, they'll prey on weakness, but they weren't sure what they could get away with, and better just leave them alone. You might be better off in that condition. And getting on the phone, calling Laura. And Laura was already packing up. It was a marriage that was never a marriage. And it was a straw that broke her back. And she was packing up and taking the kids and going back to San Jose with her family. And I, on the phone, just weeping, and she hadn't heard me cry. And weeping and just telling her, I don't blame you. I'm just so sorry for all that pain and all that hurt. It began to, in those days, also the joy was coming and that feeling of that great weight taken off me. But there was also the reality of the sin and the pain and the consequences. And that laid on me heavy for a long time. And so Laura would tell you later, she said, I heard something different in your voice. And she said, I couldn't tell what it was, but something was different. And of course, I had no theology, brother. I just said, Jesus, Jesus. And, well, what about this? Well, Jesus. And so and then I called my mom and dad, and I remember they were Catholics. And I in tears, was just, I'm so sorry. I'm in jail. I'm going back to prison, but I met Jesus. And my dad said, well, that's a new one, Chuck, but we're not getting you out. Wow. And I said, I don't care if I ever get out. I mean, that's where I was. I knew I was going back to prison. And so for the next couple of days, I just making phone calls back and forth to the Lord. So, well, I'm going to hang out for a bit. But, Chuck, I just, I said, look, at whatever you want to do, but it's going to be okay. I don't know how, but it's going to be okay. Well, I had no history of faith with the Lord, but as a brand new believer, I saw him do some things that wouldn't be biblically be classified as miracle, but they were miraculous. I had a $85,000 bail, so I wasn't going nowhere. So I put in for a bail reduction hearing. They dropped it to like $60,000. So every day, Daryl, I'm sitting there and I'm reading the scripture. And late at night, holding it up where the light's hitting, and I'm reading that, you're a new creation in Christ. Behold, the old has passed away and all things are new. And those things are, man, they're exploding on my mind. I mean, this is true truth. And now I got the author living inside me. And this makes sense. I'm going, wow, that's me. I'm a new creation. I remember like the second weekend there, and I was struggling with so the 12 steps and the AA and the programs, you need to go make amends to the people you hurt. And I'm going, Lord, I'll get 1,000,000 years if I start going and all the people in the neighborhood, I'm the one that burglarized your house, I did your business, I'm the one that did this. And I remember turning to Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28, I believe. You thieves who stole, steal no longer, but with your hands work and give to those that have a need. And I thought, he put that in there right now. He had to, because I was wrestling with that all day, and there was the answer right there. I didn't have to go and literally do that. I just need to stop stealing and make amends, be good. And so those first 2-3 weeks of reading God's Word, it was unbelievable. And I knew right away that this is real, this is true, this is true truth, this is all I need. This is the direction. This is purpose. This is the real deal. I never got into a phase where I was wrestling. I hope this is real. I wonder if heaven's really... No, I was 100% on board day one, never any doubts. But so anyway, I was just praying, Lord, I know I'm going back to prison. I'm good with that, but I really want to go out and see my family. I want to look them in the eye. I want to hug them. I want to look them in the eye and tell them how sorry I am. I want to tell them I love them. And Lord, I want to tell them about you. And Lord, I know you can make that happen. And I'd read about Peter in prison in Acts. And I said, I don't know if he'll do it that way, but you could, Lord. And so I talked to my lawyer and I said, I'd like you to put me in for another bail reduction hearing. And he said, well, you've already had one and it's reasonable for your background. And I'd been in the judicial system long enough to know that he worked for me. So I told him, look, just put in the paperwork and put it in. We'll see what happens. And Daryl, I was just praying. Again, I got no history of faith. I just knew God was real. Some things had changed instantly. As I looked out on blacks and Latinos, all that hatred, it was unbelievable to me that right away that was just gone. I didn't have to do a process or a program. I didn't have to catch myself. I didn't have to say, no, you can't think that way anymore. It was just gone. I mean, I realized really quickly, and again, never a bright kid or guy, and but realized really quickly there's only two groups, as I understand it. Those that are in, those that are out, those that are Christ, those that aren't. That's the only two groups. And I did read in, I remember, God's no respecter of persons, and not many wives and not many mighty, and all those things were just, I was starting to remember that stuff. And again, that was part of what God used to show me how real he was, that I was a burnout, what they call it, just a drug burnout. I could hardly string a couple sentences together. It's hard to me to have cognitive thought and reason, and really rapidly after regeneration, God began to restore just through reading his word, through pondering it, through thinking. So I was just praying, Lord, I know you could. So anyway, they called my name one morning, brother, about my third week in there. And you don't know what they're going. They just call your name. I don't know what I'm going down for. They shackle you up. You go down to court. You're in a jury box with a bunch of other knuckleheads, and you're waiting for see what's happening. My lawyer came over and he said, "Well, you got another bail reduction hearing, but I wouldn't count on anything." And I said, and I'm just praying, Lord, I know you can do this, and Lord, just please, Daryl, I want to go home so bad. Not for me, really. I just needed to look him in the face and hug him and tell him I loved him. So I can remember this like it was yesterday. The judge gets to my Holmes, and I stand up, and he's reading, well, this bail looks reasonable, and I'm not in the habit of overturning another judge's decision. And he stopped right in the middle of a sentence, just stopped. And 30, 40 seconds go by, and I look, and the court stenographer's looking up at him, and the lawyers are kind of looking at each other because it was an awkward silence. And all of a sudden he said, you know what, I see some mitigating circumstances here, and I'm going to drop this bail to $3,500.
Wow.
And my lawyer looked at, and so I was out there. My sister posted the bail, and I got out that next day. Laura picked me up, and I got in the car, just weeping, and I'm just telling her about Jesus and talking about a new creation. And I got to take this King James Bible out with me, and we're riding home, and I'm showing, look at what it says here, and she's going, oh yeah, you know that. And so she didn't know. She had had some kind of religious experience early in life, but she knew a lot more than I did before I met the Lord. So we get home, Daryl, and there was hours of just weeping, hugging, a deep remorse. She saw that right away. She said, something happened to this guy. And then went over to my parents and came in with a weeping and hugging. And my mom just knew right away. I mean, my mom stuck with me through all those prison sentences and just always figured out, you know, that guy got stabbed because he kept attacking my son, you know. And so they didn't really understand, but I just told them about Jesus. And so I remember going over there 3 days later, and this was my gospel at that time to my dad and mom, who were Catholics. Mary can't help you. Got to get rid of that rosary. Beads won't work. There is no purgatory. You got to be born again, or you're going to hell. And my mom and dad looked at me like, whoa, careful, slow down. And so my dad had a St. Christopher medal that had been glued on the dash of every car he'd ever had since I could remember. And so anyway, they couldn't deny what they saw. So we know in Matthew 10, the Lord talks about, you know, I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. And that will separate families and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. And that often happens in family. Both you and I know families like that. You know, you've found that religion. You know, don't bring that Jesus stuff in here. Good for you, and that often happens. Darkness always hates light and makes it uncomfortable if nothing else. And so, but I got to see my mom and dad in their 70s come to Christ in repentance and faith, get baptized. My wife.
Wow.
My brother, my sister and her husband, all genuine conversions, all within that first 3 months. And I got to watch them all get baptized and profess Christ. And so, yeah, just God so blessed me. And so I went to court, and everybody good enough. I mean, Laura knows I'm going to do some time, and we're okay with that. I mean, whatever God wants to do, very quickly, I was okay. Now, I was watching TBN. You know, I tell people it's just ignorance on fire. I remember sending money in to Ken Copeland, and yet I know God paid for that on the cross. So, paid for that sin. But so, love Jesus, but theology a little weak. I remember calling Lawrence and go, I speak in tongues, it came, and I even know what I'm saying. Oh boy. I had it all going on. Right. So I got to, so they recommended 10 years. I went to court, and the lawyer before court, Daryl, says, this judge he's the hanging judge. Let's postpone this. Let's get a mitigating hearing. I said, no, we're ready. We don't want to wait any longer. God's in control. And he's going, he said, well, God doesn't come in the courtroom with you. I said, we're going now. And so the whole time I know I'm going back. I'm not asking not to go back to prison, but I am asking the Lord. I realized pretty quickly my responsibility as a dad and a husband was to be with my wife and provide and lead my wife. So I was just asked, God, be merciful to me. You know, whatever that looks like to you, Lord, be merciful to me. Well, they recommended 10 years, and I got 2 years. Sentenced me to 2 years. And Laura tells a story. There was a gal next to her. Laura started weeping. And the gal leaned over and said, it's okay. It's just 2 years. And she said, no, it was supposed to be 10. And it was tears of joy. So I got to the prison yard, and Laura and I looked at her from the jury box, and we're both crying, and we're both smiling, and because God had been so good.
Right.
And so got to the first cell and got in with a guy in God's gracious providence. There was a Christian. And so we're talking about the Lord, and I'm talking about tongues and the gifts. And he was very patient. And he said, well, he said, there's different views on that. And he said, why don't we go to Scripture and see what the Scripture says about that? And I said, yeah, we can do that. I thought, I'm going to get him zapped, because he's got knowledge and denying its power here. Right. And so, and then he had a cassette player there with some cassette tapes. And he said, hey, would you like to listen to the Word of God? This is a guy named John MacArthur. And I said, sure. And it was so Grace to You, back then, had the lending library, and they would send out cassette tapes and to prisoners or free people, whoever wanted them. So you could get 7 at a time. And so my first exposure to the Word of God, rightly divided, was a voice that we both come to love and appreciate. I stuck in that first cassette tape and put on those earphones, and he introduced me to James, the half-brother of a half-brother. Why is he just half-brother? And didn't know nothing. I'm a blank slate. And by the time we got to that third or fourth message, all that other stuff just disappeared. And I began to listen to the Word of God, rightly divided. And that voice became such a comfort to me. And so I went through the book of James, and then I went through the book of Matthew with 220 messages. Come on, John. Yeah. You could have done this in a lot less time than that. And yet I'd listen to those messages, Daryl, and sometimes I'd listen to a particular one, for 3 times. Yeah. And then I had a radio that was cassette to cassette. And so a lot of times I would record that tape onto I'd get a tape, 90-minute tape at the commissary, and I'd record it. And then I had a mic, Laura wish I didn't, that I could plug in and interject, stop the tape, the message go, no, Laura, you need to listen to this because you got issues here. And so I recorded, I don't know, dozens of tapes and would send them out to Laura, particular messages. So God eased my heart I was leading her, and she'd come to visit almost every weekend and bring Daniel. And man, it was walking in prayer and telling her what I was learning. And we were both smokers. And so I remember I got to the yard, and about my second, third week there, I'm telling this guy about Christ, and I got my Bible and I'm smoking. And he goes, hey, you're not a Christian, you smoke. And I thought, oh, no, Lord, not these. I mean, leave me with something. And so got rid of that. And then the Lord came for a visit, and I said, hey, smoking's got to go. Oh, no, come on, leave me with something. So I said, we can do this. And so it was kind of a funny story. I said, well, I'm going to quit. And the third day in that, I just caved. And then I backed up and just went, I never even asked God to help me with this. And so I prayed. So a lot of prayer and a couple bags of Jolly Ranchers, and he took that from me. Yeah. But just watching him work those first months in prison. So I'm listening to the messages. Now I've got guys waiting on them, and John wasn't out with his Bible yet.
So you have your sort of own lending library going on right
I
there.
do have it. Yeah, and I've got 7 or 8 guys in line, and so you've got, when you get the message, you got 2 hours to listen to it, and then it has to get, and then the last guy, it has to get quick because I need to mail him back to get the next 7. So I was on that particular yard a year, and really began discipling and mentoring at that point, just through tapes and books, and very charismatic. Wasn't a lot of sound theology, particularly then. The face of the prison system's changed over these 30 years. There's a lot more guys on the yards that are grounded in the Word, and just because of the availability and ministries that are sending that stuff in. But the charismatics pretty much own the thing for many years. So I was always battling them. And I was a gunslinger. You know, once I'd gone through with John, 1 Corinthians 12, 13, 14, saw Paul's argument about tongues, you know, the singular tongues, and really kind of put it together. Now I'm out on the yard, not making any bridges, but creating a lot of walls, you know, just a gunslinger. And the Lord had some work to do in that area. And so over the course of that 2 years, Daryl, I listened to 3,500 messages by John.
Wow.
He was my father in the faith. And John doesn't have a lot of yucks or humor in his messages, but overall that many. I learned Patricia and his son and the accident and Shepherd's Conferences, never realizing that in God's providence, I'd be going to Shepherd's Conferences, 20 of them, and Strange Fire and Truth Matters Conference, and John would be in my home. Chris Mueller was at the church I was at for a while and brought John over. He knew my love for John and my testimony, brought John over. I had 2 hours, and funny, Daryl, so we were sending that Bible in, and at first it was hardback. Initially, the Geneva Study Bible that Sproul came out with, and John's wasn't out. It was right behind it. So with a few of the guys, I'd send a Geneva to, but I'd make notes. Now, you can't trust this.
Right.
And we don't
Your
baptize infants, and we're not covenant. So I'd have to put disclaimers in it. And so when John's Bible came out, well, a lot of prisons wouldn't take hardback books. And so they either cut the covers off. Now, there was some that would, so I'd send them as we could afford them. The ministry at that time became a 501c3 and had some supporters. And
this is Mount Nebo.
This is Mount Nebo, I'm sorry. Yeah, so people ask, where'd Mount Nebo come from? Well, if you go back to the story of Moses, and we remember where God told him to speak to the rock, and he struck the rock twice. And I remember as I read through that, and because you've dishonored me, you will not enter the promised land. And then God takes him up on Mount Nebo. And it even says his eyes were, he was still good to go. He wasn't an old guy, he might as well die here anyway. And let him look into the promised land. But couldn't enter in because of that one act. And I remember thinking, that's a little tight. And it took me a while to realize that God is that holy. It's Uzzah reaching out for the cart.
Right. I was just thinking that.
And it's those kind of things, and you go, and I thought, I love the principles in that story. That water came out. It says the animals got their water. The results were the same. So God's not interested in results. He's interested in obedience. Which takes a lot of weight off for ministry.
Yeah.
You don't have to produce results.
Right.
Just be obedient.
Yeah.
Serve the Lord. Do what he says. And the other thing that I came out was, keep an eye on the promised land. This is not our home. We're just passing through. We're biblically, we're the aliens here. Not our home. And again, now at 75 years old, my eyes aren't dim, and I can see that promised land. And so I'm very thankful to be in a very solid church. I'm in my last 2 minutes of play. I'm good to go. I'm blessed in my life, but my longing to be home continues to grow. I know heaven's real. I've read enough books on it now where it's very enticing. We just did a 5-week study at the Church on end times, and part of that's just heaven, and beginning to get my mind as much as I can with my finite mind around the wonders and glories of being in the presence of the Lord, and in the millennial kingdom, and then going into everlasting new heavens, new earth, and the joy, and that God is infinite, we're finite, and so all through eternity, we'll never grasp the fullness of the joy and awe of the Lord. It will just grow. It won't be, we've been here 50 billion years, getting a little old on this. No.
Right.
Just never will get to that place of fullness because God is infinite. And so I know that stuff's real, and why would you really want to stay here? But God's got us doing what he's got us doing, and thankful for it. But there's that Paul, hard pressed, better to be gone, be with him. And so, so Mount Nebo now is, I remember having John to the house, and when he came, we had negotiated with Thomas Nelson to get a paperback. They hadn't made any paperbacks, and they made it just for us. And when I got that first batch, I took off the first Bible, the first paperback Bible, and signed it for John. And you may not remember that, but so when he came, I said, I signed a Bible for you. Always wanted to do that. He signed two.
I remember it.
Yeah. He got a great memory.
Yeah, he does.
So he came, and that day in God's gracious providence, just got 5 pallets of MacArthur Study Bibles delivered to my garage.
Wow.
So as we talked inside and I took him out the shipping, you could hardly get through because he looked at it, 5 pallets. It's a lot of Bibles, bro. And then took him into shipping. He had a lot of questions, and he asked a lot of questions. Wasn't taking any notes.
Sure.
And he preached at our church 5 sermons because we were doing 2 on Saturday, 3 on Sunday. Anyway, when he went back for a Sunday evening service, baptism service, I had a guy call me and said, you know what, John shared about meeting you and your ministry, talked about it for about 8 minutes. He said, would you like that recording? Do you think?
Right.
Yeah. And so, and I still got that, the audio on the website. It was just and I couldn't believe the particulars that he remembered. And very humbling. In fact, after I listened to it the second time, it was so... just held me up so hard. It's kind of uncomfortable for me to listen to it. I like it on the website where people can hear it.
Yeah.
And then John wrote a handwritten letter on Mount Nebo's behalf, which if you're around Grace long enough, they have their own mission and their own ministries, but just such a validation of Mount Nebo, how he saw it, a strong recommendation. I got that letter, the original, framed up on my wall, and. God honors the man and honors the church that honor his word and the ministry that honors his word. And, I've had people over the years say, well, you're a little cultish on the MacArthur thing. And I said, well, I love John MacArthur. And he's got a global pulpit. And he preaches the word. And he's solid, and he stands against the errors and against the attacks in our time. And so I love him with all my heart. And sometimes I'll be having a disagreement with someone about John, and there's a little part of the prison thing wants to rise up and say, how about I just punch you in your nose? Which could put a real blight on the ministry. But so a
small blight.
Yeah, so I have to reel it back in. Another thing I wanted to say, when I got into this, started to do the ministry, it was very shoestring. I was working, buying books as I could afford them, send them in. It was just mostly Arizona, and all of a sudden I got the prison grapevines like they got a Verizon or something in there, because all of a sudden I got a letter from New Mexico, and some guy said, hey, I heard you'll send me a book, and I said, wow. So I was buying books as I could afford them, and then I went to the church that I was in, saw what I was doing, came, said, we'd like to help, and so I said, well, how much? And they said, we'll tell you when you're a load. And so now it's starting to pick up steam. And early on, Darryl, I just had that conversation with the Lord as a master manipulator. I don't want to go out and raise funds. I don't want to beat the bushes for money. I don't want to do fundraisers.
You sound like George Mueller.
Like George Mueller. And that's where I got it, reading George Mueller's biography. And sometimes, as you know, the food would show up the morning he needed it. Because here's what I know. We both know God doesn't have a money problem. And he's not that you look down, oh, no, I forgot George and the orphan. So in every detail, aware of everything. So the first 10 years was shoestring and stretched me out a lot. I was on my knees a lot, which is always a good thing, but never, ever had to say no. He met every need he brought, and it continued to grow. And as people asked me about the ministry, I'd share with them, but never did any fundraisers, never went out to try to ask people for help. People got to know me personally and the ministry and what we were doing, and I always kept it lean and mean, working out of the house, shipping at home. The money goes toward the ministry. I mean, I do draw a salary, but the money goes to the ministry. And I've just seen God work now 30 years later. There's times, things that come along when you buy 2,500 Bibles, it takes a good chunk of money. So I've had God put people in my life, and when you need that kind of money, just call us. Been very faithful in providing those big checks when they're needed. But then we have a small donor base, but they're faithful. They've been with us for years. God always meets the needs he brings, and he's a good God, brother. He's just a good God.
We're both miracles. Chuck, as we start to wrap up this episode of the Truth Matters podcast, you talked earlier about resources that come into the prisons. You know, we've talked about the MacArthur Study Bible and how about Mount Nebo being the largest distributor of the English version of the MacArthur Study Bible in the world. We've talked about Foundations of Faith, that curriculum, systematic theology structure of that. Let me ask you, what are some other books and resources that John and Grace to You have provided to you through Mount Nebo, and what are some of the more popular, as you answer that question, also talk about what are some of the more popular resources from Grace to You and John that the prisoners are requesting from the prisons that you support?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, you know, the first book I ever read by John was The Gospel According to Jesus. And of course, few of his books, a lot of them are controversial in one reason, but that was very controversial.
Very.
The whole Lordship salvation issue.
Yep.
But that was the first book I read. And for me, it really set my foundation on what the gospel is and what it isn't. And so that's a book that and then, you know, you asked John about, have you written anything on the gospel? I mean, you know, ashamed of the gospel. And so for me, at the heart of the ministry is I want men and women to understand what the gospel is.
It's fundamental.
And what it isn't. That's I mean, we can end time stuff and we can agree to disagree on a number of things. But the gospel, we can't. It's what's brought so much division to the church with the whole woke social justice. It's a gospel issue. It's another gospel.
It's another gospel.
And so there's no wiggle room on that. So a lot of the books John's books that deal directly with the gospel. Because I know, you met a guy earlier today, Manny Flores. And once Manny knew what the gospel was, he's in prison for decades knowing what the gospel is and what it isn't. So he can teach, confront error, teach truth. So that's at the heart of a lot of John's books is the gospel. And then, of course, Strange Fire, dealing with the charismatics. I've never read a book by John that I didn't love. I think some are maybe more significant, depending on where you're at and who you are. But I also love that in John's writings, he mentions other people. I mean, that's where I go. There's other people writing books. So Spurgeon, Lloyd Jones, Boyce, and then the Puritans, and we talked about that. And but Grace to You, I mean, just always had a significant discount in books. But now, in recent years, they told me that through prison chaplains, that they would supply me with as many books as I wanted, John's books for prison chaplains. And of course, my first question is, what's the limit?
Right. Yeah.
And it said, there is no limit. So now, and I want to be a good steward with those resources. So I could send large orders into 400 or 500 prisons right away, but a lot of them would get destroyed. A lot of them, the chaplains would leave in a warehouse. A lot of them aren't John MacArthur guys. So strategically, I find the chaplains that care about doctrine, that care about the sheep, that have a library where those books are checked in and out, and I'll order them. I'm guessing some of these orders are $5,000-$6,000 worth of books. You know, one title, it might be 6 or 7. Charismatic Chaos, I send those in by a half dozen at a time. And so Grace to You has just, and with the fundamentals of the faith, I mean, for cost is what we get those for. And those go in by the thousands. This ministry, from a human perspective, would not be what it is, would not do what it does without Grace to You. Their just overwhelming generosity. It wouldn't be what it was without John MacArthur in his teaching and his personal encouragement to me and friendship. It wouldn't be without Grace Community Church. I've got a church in Arizona I love. This is my second. I'm at home here. I have people I love here. So thankful for this ministry. I could bring, if the Lord would allow me, I could bring 100 men here tomorrow from around the country that have benefited just like I have from the materials, from both the teaching, the books, the fundamentals of the faith. Literally thousands and thousands of men, Daryl, that have got their foundation through the fundamentals of the faith and the MacArthur Study Bible. Manny, who you met, his pastor, showed me a Bible that I sent him 20 years ago. He still got it. It's a paperback. It's been bandaged up. You open it up, and I mean, it's just, and he's got all his notes in there, and I couldn't believe it. I mean, it's a paperback Bible. They're not supposed to last that long. So guys get those. They're a treasure in there. If I could actually see the faces when I send these Bibles into these guys who completed the workbook, and they all get an A or a B. A lot of them never had a grade. And so they get an A or a B, and that they get called the property, and they open that box up, and there's that MacArthur Bible. And man, they're absorbed in it. And the Spirit uses it. It's just such a wonderful tool.
Chuck, how can people reach the Mount Nebo website? What's your website address?
If you just typed in Mount Nebo Prison Ministry, you'd get to us, or the initials mnpm.org. Website's doing a little construction, but you can get to it. If you wanted to hear John's audio on there, so the website gives a picture of who we are and what we do, and it's there. And so anytime we would do something like this, I need to stop, and I want to honor the men that have honored the ministry and the church, but it's our gracious, wondrous Savior, Jesus Christ, who deserves all the honor and the glory. And I can't wait till the day where we can give that full expression of that, brother, because he is so good all the time. God is good all the time.
Chuck, I have no words, man. I mean, I'm looking at you as a brother, but you're a dear friend. You're a dear friend. You and I have not known each other that long, but I just have to say, man, you have a deep place right here in my heart, brother.
Well,
and,
I love you, Daryl, and I love Virgil too. And you're a great. You guys are just. You've been so helpful to me in my personal life with the podcasts and the friendship. And I feel the same way, brother. I just, I love you. Feel like I've known you for decades. And, hope to see you often.
Well, thanks again, Chuck, for spending the time. And thank you all for joining us. We will see you down the road. Thank you.